You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. Discussing dying and making end-of-life plans remain taboo for many people in the UK. A survey by charity Dying Matters reveals that more than 70% of people in Britain are uncomfortable talking about death. A poll of 2,000 adults for the Charities Coalition of Care Organisations indicates that only 21% of people have discussed their end-of-life wishes. Only a third said they had written a will, and just 29% had let loved ones know of their funeral wishes. Around 500,000 people die in England each year. Half of all those people die in hospital, yet 2/3 of us would prefer to die at home. And only a quarter of men and just over 1 in 3 women across England have told anyone about the funeral arrangements they would like to have after they die. So why do people in Britain shy away from discussing this important subject? Is it a case of being a bit stiff upper lip about it? And what does death mean in our society? And is our attitude towards death changing? I'm joined by Jo Levinson, Director of Communications at Dying Matters Coalition and the National Council for Palliative Care. On Skype, we're joined by Rebecca Green, who's a death doula. And also on the panel is Rosie Inman-Cook from the Natural Death Centre and the Association of Natural Burial Grounds. I think I'd like to start by introducing you to the audience by telling us a little bit about yourselves. Rebecca Green, you're a death doula. That's not something people hear of every day. Could you tell us what you do?
It kind of evolved naturally out of my job as a nurse. I'm still a practicing nurse as well. That's where I kind of learnt the job. It's really just being a companion to people that are dying, and I've also got a skill set, having worked as a nurse for 18 years in a variety of clinical settings, where I'm able to anticipate some of the journeys that they might go on throughout the healthcare system, and to be able to offer them some clarity in that, because it is quite a juggernaut, the NHS. It's oversubscribed and underfunded, and it causes a lot of problems for people. I think they lose their sense of it's difficult to have some personalness with it. So that's why I kind of went ahead and did this. The biggest difference, I think, between a nurse and a death doula or end-of-life companion is I'm not allied to medicine as nurses are. This is an independent role. Also, I'm not an organisation. I'm a person. I'm not a charity or a business. And I need to have that level of freedom to be effective, and also to sort of operate outside of the economy as much as I can. Or I can't be as responsive as I need to be. What I actually do really varies from person to person. It could be just a couple of meetings. It could be, in one case, I moved in and lived with a person for a week until they died at home. Could be some help with end-of-life planning, giving them some opportunity just to sort of vent and get to know themselves a bit better and where they stand with this event that they're going to be meeting. I don't do it very often. I can go for years sometimes without working with a person. It's just only at any given person's request, if they know about me, if they know that I exist and that I do this. I think the circumstances of a person's death can be like the least influential factor in how they die, even though there is a lot of focus at the moment on end-of-life planning. But it's really how you've lived that will influence how you die more than anything. And I would say that there isn't really any such group as the dying, because we're all dying. You know, each person is completely, they're going to face this completely as they will every other day that they've lived. And no one really addresses that. So that's one of the major reasons that I do this. And that obviously has nothing whatsoever to do with medical care or the illness itself. It's the person's relationship with their life.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think I'll turn to Jo Levinson, who's on our panel from Dying Matters Coalition. You were both nodding there to what Rebecca had to say about at the end there about it not being discussed. Tell us what you do. What is Dying Matters?
The Dying Matters Coalition is a UK-based, very broad coalition. It includes hospices, doctors, nurses, funeral directors, lawyers, lots of charities, all of whom share the belief that actually we benefit by talking more openly about dying, death and bereavement. If we lose that, if you like, stiff upper lip or that reluctance to face up to our own mortality, we're more likely to get our wishes met. We're more likely to be able to be support for people we know, family, friends who are terminally ill, and more likely to be able to be supportive to people who've been bereaved. And certainly at the Dying Matters Coalition, our evidence has shown that in Britain, people on the whole aren't comfortable talking about dying. They're not comfortable facing up to their own mortality. They're not making their wishes known. And actually none of us benefit from that, even though we recognise talking about dying is rarely an easy conversation to have.
Rosie Inman-Cook, again agreeing with Joe there that we don't talk about it enough. You talk about it a lot. Can you tell us what you do?
We run a helpline, amongst other things. The Natural Death Centre charity, we've been going for 24 years now, and we get thousands of families contacting us with all sorts of different queries with all death and dying and funeral related issues. The one thing about communication I'd like to say is obviously it's crucial, and it makes it so much easier for those left behind to know where to start and what to organise. But so often I'm talking with elderly people on the phone, and they're saying, my children, adult children, won't talk to me about it. They tell me to shut up. They don't want to engage with the subject. So I've got a few sort of tips that I tried to help them with, how to get the conversation that their family don't want to have, even though they're wanting to express it.
I was going to ask you, actually, Rebecca, before I wanted to also introduce the other panel members. Do you feel then that you are sometimes a stand-in for a family member? Like Rosie mentioned, you're almost offering sort of therapy on relationship tips on how to deal with death within a family. Are you compensating for someone, Rebecca?
I think it's not something that a family member could or may not want to do. I mean, I'm currently working with just one person at the moment who's actively asking me to act as a buffer between her and her family, because she knows what they're likely to do, which is to create quite a lot of drama around the situation, which she really doesn't want. She's very, very reconciled with the situation, and she's very clear about what she wants at the end of her life, including, really right up to the very end. And she's asked me to act as an advocate, which I get asked to do sometimes because of our relationship with technology is so complex now with medical technology, but also with the family as well. Sometimes that can happen. So I wouldn't say I'm not a stand-in for the family. I don't have that intimacy with the person. I'm very neutral. It sometimes requires that level of neutrality. This lady in particular, she has family members that she know they're not able to accept that she's coming to the end of her life, and she wants to be able to die alone. So she's asking me to help her to facilitate that. So that isn't a family member. That's something else.
Why don't people in Britain seem to want to confront this topic? Rosie and Rebecca have given good examples already quite quickly as to what they do, and it's almost bridging that gap between the communication of the family and the person who's passing away. Why are families ill-prepared or not keen to talk about it? Joe?
I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, for many of us, it is a difficult subject to talk about. It's one that we, I guess, existentially can find our heads quite difficult to get around, but we can find it very upsetting. That's not to say everyone does, but many of us do. We don't want to wake up in the morning and think about dying on the whole. And we also are aware it could be even if we feel able to have those discussions, those close to us, like Rebecca was just saying, might actually find it quite difficult. So I think that's what it's a very emotional subject. I think it's worth reflecting as well how society has changed. In many ways, it should be a cause for celebration that we're not having to think about dying all the time. We have, very healthy life expectancy rates. Most of us in the UK aren't directly affected by war and conflict. We're not on the whole dying before our time. But I think that the sort of downside really of that, what I would say is real progress, social progress, is that we've lost that ability to talk about dying. Dying happens far more behind closed doors. Grief happens far more behind closed doors. And I think that's a change that's come about because of very welcome developments, but it's led to real problems that most of us don't feel comfortable facing up to dying and talking about it.
Rosie, what sort of problems do you see? Do you agree with Joe there?
I do, but bottom line, people are scared of dying. They don't, and with regards to talking about it, they think they might be tempting fate.
Well, yeah, that goes on to the sort of, don't talk about this. Oh, don't mention that. Oh, you can't say that.
Yeah.
That we must keep this behind closed doors. But obviously you're saying and you're suggesting that this is becoming a bit of a social problem in Britain, that we're not actually discussing death or looking at alternatives. And the examples you and Rebecca have given are that there are alternatives to what is a classic funeral that we see or we think that our relatives are going to want.
I agree, but I think things are far better than they were 10 years ago and definitely 20 years ago, and people are starting to engage with the topic
What's changed in the last 20 years?
Us, Dying Matters, the press, and it just generally people are talking about it a little bit more. But
do you think that social media, the internet, has helped that?
Possibly, all of it. But it's still a problem. We're getting better, though, slowly.
What's the actual, when you say problem, what is the problem?
The problem of not communicating. When I'm in my role as a cemetery manager, family walk through the door, they don't know where to start. They don't know actually if the deceased wanted to be buried or cremated, whether they're making the right decision. If they feel they're doing the wrong thing, it's a huge extra stress on top of their grief.
So how are families supposed to know what to do?
Well, they should have had that conversation and said, when my time comes, you know what to do with me. Even if they don't write it down, even if they don't have a prepaid funeral plan, which isn't necessarily the best thing to do. It's that just letting everybody know where to start. The family who walk through the door, who've got it written down on a piece of paper, right, this is what Dad wants, blah, blah, blah. And it's so much simpler for them.
I would agree actually there with Rosie. I think something that's sometimes misunderstood is that the funeral, in many ways, it's for the family, it's not for the deceased. And I've worked with people a little bit in funeral planning. I'm not a celebrant, but the greatest success that I've had in conversations about end-of-life planning that concern funerals is when the person has really got a grip of that the funeral is for the deceased. It's actually a ceremony to help ground them in their loss, and it's something that's not just a consumer sort of product as it's sold all too often in our society, but it's actually it's a rite of passage, and it's really to anchor the people who've been deceased in the process of, like, the fact that they're alive and that there's someone who's gone. And it's that simple, but that's what sort of makes it profound and difficult to talk about. And I've planned my own funeral around the people that I think are at this point in my life most likely to be there should I die anytime soon. It's not for myself, it's for them. Does that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Rosie?
I think maybe Rebecca's talking about the ceremony as a separate issue to the actual disposal. A funeral, there's a mishmash of ideas that people put together. They are separate things. The actual hard, practical decisions of the disposal are different from the style of ceremony, and I absolutely agree. You can give ideas about what you'd like for your ceremony, but the family can do what on earth they like, technically.
Going back to what you mentioned, Rebecca, about it being a rite of passage, do you think that society in Britain has lost touch of what was a rite of passage? Loss
is showing its face more as become a little bit... Well, we're very spoilt, really, aren't we, as Westerners? We don't have to face very much in the way of danger on a daily basis. As Joe pointed out, we can be a little bit sort of almost a bit divorced from your physical body in some ways. And just after death, the relatives that are left behind, they've been really touched by this reality. It is a big reality, and it's a big problem that in our society there are no references to death with any reality in them. So they're kind of left in this state, a little bit of wandering. And again, I am talking about more the aspects of funerals which are to do with ceremony and rites of passage, not so much the practicalities of it, as Rosie was describing, although I'm sure she obviously has an input in that as well. That's what the ceremony is for. In an ideal situation, if a person, for example, died at home, I would start the ceremony there at the point of death, to really think about how much time does everybody want to spend with the person who's passed away, with their body, just to come to terms with it, how you wash the body, how you care for it, the relationship really between life and death. The people that are left living they're right on that cusp, and it's really something that we don't have to deal with in our daily lives. So possibly if this call is coming that people want something with a bit more reality, or they want to ground themselves in it, it could be because we do live quite an intellectual sort of life. Everything's done for us. We're not exactly sort of running around hunting. You don't see death. So what do you do with it when you see it? And it can be an incredible shock. I've seen people's minds literally go into shock when they see a dead body because they've never seen anything like that before. So a ceremony is to really process that.
Rosie, you wanted to speak up then.
A couple of points. I think 2 world wars did a huge amount of damage to the way, as a society, we coped with death. The Victorians engaged with it very closely. They lost half their children for a start, but and then I think the enormous, vile reality of losing millions of people in the two world wars gave us a very different approach to how we coped. Secondly, with regards to dying at home, I'm getting increasing numbers of people phoning up who are wanting to keep and look after the dead at home rather than getting them carted off by a funeral director. So just following on from what Rebecca was saying.
Yeah, I'd like you to tell us more a little bit, actually, about what you do and the burials at home, and the fact that not a lot of people know that you can, in fact, bury someone in a back garden.
Most people don't know a lot of things about death. We are very lucky in Britain. We've got freedoms that the rest of the world, the rest of Europe do not have with regards to keeping a body at home, directing your own funeral. You don't need and you don't have to employ a funeral director. As you said, burial on private land is perfectly possible, and it's very straightforward in the UK. You don't need permission from anybody. But most people don't know things like this. You don't have to have a coffin. You can have a shroud. You can just bury somebody rolled up in their favourite blankie. It's a huge, huge subject.
You say we've got more freedom than any other country in the world. Why is that?
Industry, state, church. They control, in other countries, they've got a very tight monopoly on the industry and the money that's involved. The funeral business is very valuable.
So you're saying, in Britain, though, that the funeral...
Yeah, and
you don't need to turn to a funeral director or
no,
funeral
not at
business,
all.
and not enough people know about that.
Yeah, and we're catching up with America. Actually, there's a movement in America for home funerals, which is actually it's one of the things that they're further ahead than we are. But we lead with natural burial sites and green funerals. But the US are further ahead with promoting and supporting, and they have groups that support and help families to look after their dead themselves.
And Jo, do you see a benefit to society if they knew more about the fact that you could, that Britain has such freedom to almost treat relatives and the dead as they wish?
Yeah, I think there are great benefits of that, and I think funerals and burials are very important. But I also think they're only a part of the picture, because actually, we know people in Britain, on the whole, aren't talking about dying. They're not writing wills, and our own research at Dying Matters has shown that significant numbers of people report there having been family disputes after a family member has died, often because a will wasn't written or communicated to them. We know that many people in this country still aren't registered as organ donors, or if they are registered, they haven't shared their wishes with their family members, and that can lead to really heartbreaking situations in somebody's final hours. It can actually lead to lives not being saved, potentially, because people haven't shared their wishes. We know people aren't talking about the sort of care they'd want. And I think what's really important here is to recognise it's not just the public who have problems talking about dying. Health professionals, doctors, nurses, other health professionals also find it really difficult. And so you can have a situation where people with health conditions who might be terminally ill, they might just have a serious health condition that isn't necessarily terminal, want to talk to their doctor about their wishes, about the care they'd want, about their options. And doctors quite often don't want that conversation. Again, our research has shown that 1 in 4 GPs, family doctors in Britain, have never initiated a conversation with one of their patients about end-of-life wishes, even though an average doctor will have 20 of their patients die each year. So I think this really has to be a challenge for all of us, the general public, but also health professionals. Funerals are important, but actually the whole spectrum of things as a society, we're really not talking openly enough, and actually we all lose out as a result of that.
It's a very sombre subject, but actually in this environment it doesn't feel too much of a sombre subject to talk about. How can we present death to more people as not being such a sombre discussion? That's obviously what you have to do. You're saying, no, not going to answer that one. Jo or Rebecca? Jo first.
I think it is a sombre subject. That doesn't have to mean that every discussion has to be very sombre. Humour can play a really important role actually here, and certainly at the Dying Matters Coalition we produce several resources featuring well-known comedians, for example a couple of short films. We had one with the comedian Alexi Sal who was interviewing 4 people who are terminally ill, reflecting on how humour has allowed them to cope with the experience, allow them to break down some of the barriers about talking about it with their family members. So humour can play a role. But lots of this is actually about very practical discussions. And even if you might not be able to start those discussions by saying what you would want to happen to you, very often people are able to have strong views what they wouldn't want to happen to them, about the sort of care they would or wouldn't want to have, where they'd be cared for, who they might not want their, annoying great aunt to inherit something or to inherit something from them. So very often if you talk about what you don't want, it can be a gateway to actually talking in a very positive way about what the sort of care you would want, the legacy you'd leave after you die, and how you'd want people close to you to relate to you both while you're alive and to honour your memory once you've gone.
Rosie.
It comes back again to this question of communication. And what I'd like to point out to those who are listening, it is really common for families after a death to completely implode. And it is so sad. And you get siblings who from that point will never speak again. And families, especially the dysfunctional ones, will completely collapse. It's very sad. And it all comes, if the person who was dying had actually been a little bit more forthright and planned ahead and had those discussions, maybe they could have calmed it down a bit. And whether it's families with this old chips on shoulders, old jealousies, all sorts of things rear their ugly heads when there's a death. It's very common.
Can I ask all of you personally, and I'll go back to you, Rebecca. You did answer it a bit at the beginning, but why do you do what you do? Why do you surround your life with death?
I don't surround my life with death at all. I do what I do very infrequently, actually. As I've said, it's not a business or it's nothing formal. I just do it. I only work with one person at a time.
But what drives you to okay, you don't do it all the time, but what is there that drives you to do what you do with that one person when it comes about?
Me personally, I can see that I've got a knack for it. I've just got a gift for it. I've known it since I was a young child. I mean, a lot of my family died when I was a young child, and it was all of them came to me. I have no idea why, they just did. And then as I got older and as I had more experience with this, because I became a nurse afterwards, I just saw that I wasn't afraid of it. And I don't know why that is, but it's a fact. I'm not. And it means that people who are with me that are dying are just quite relaxed with me. And I mean, a lot of the conversations we have, I love that film with Alexis Sale that's on the Dying Matters website. A lot of the time we spend together, it's very much like that, actually. We just have a good laugh and we're quite normal with each other, and they can say anything they want to say because there's millions of taboos within taboos within taboos. Death is not the greatest taboo, not by a long shot. And, there are many other things that people can't speak about. And they seem to just find that they can do it with me, which is great. So, I'll just do what I do because I can. I heartily recommend people watching that film on the Dying Matters website. I think it's brilliant. It really gives you an insight into how alone people who are dying can be, and that they're just them. They're still just them. They're not the dying. You are who you are, and you can't change that. Right up to the very end, there's it's good to talk about it as long as you don't introduce even more drama, I think, sometimes, or somberness. It's not really about that. Thank
you, Rebecca. Finally, Rosie, you 25 years helpline, burial sites, advice. Why do you do what you do?
Some days I wonder. I take call after call of desperately sad things I hear, and I quite often burst into tears when I've finished the call. Because actually those little snippets and when I was running the cemetery, those little snippets of real sorrow and witnessing such sadness are only tiny. And the majority of my day, I'm actually helping people make practical, useful decisions, giving them information. And they just constantly say, thank goodness I found your number. You're the first person who hasn't tried to sell me something. And you're giving me honest, open advice. And I get great letters of thank you and stuff. So it's job satisfaction, I suppose.
Joe, then your goal is obviously to get more people to talk about it and help families with the sort of end of life care. How do you find dealing with it, and why? First of all, why do you do it? And like Rosie there, how is it every day talking about death?
I have to say I found it quite difficult when I started in the role. I've been there just over 3 years, and my background was very much for working for charities in the UK on quite difficult issues and trying to communicate to the public, to politicians, to policymakers about quite unpopular issues. I'd worked on in prison reform and human rights and refugee issues, very difficult to communicate on. But actually, something very challenging about communicating about dying, about getting the public to address something that's going to happen to all of us. Every minute somebody in the UK dies, and practically all of us have been affected by bereavement, directly or indirectly, and we know we're going to die, but many of us find it very difficult to get our heads around. And at the Dying Matters Coalition, I think we've got 30,000 members across the UK, and it really feels like things are beginning to change bit by bit by bit. More and more organisations, I think health charities are being far more open about dying, which I think has to be a very healthy thing. Far more individuals are. There's still a long way to go. But actually, it does feel like bit by bit the barriers are breaking down. And I think I think early on you mentioned social media. I actually think social media can play a very big role. More people, for example, have posted an online or social media tribute to somebody who's died than actually talked about their own end-of-life wishes. I think social media can help break down the barriers. I think the internet can help break down barriers. I think many people can actually find it easier writing one way or another about dying and their end-of-life wishes than talking about it. And I think that's something we probably need to reflect on and embrace. But I'm in no doubt about it, even if it can be really difficult. Talk about dying can save lots of heartache and grief further on and solve lots of problems.
I'm going to end the discussion there, if that's okay. But just in case, do any of you have anything you'd like to say that I might have missed? Rebecca, Rosie or Jo?
I do, actually.
Go on then, yeah, okay. So before I finish the discussion, then yes, Rebecca.
I think one of the key things here that is going to help people more than anything, that I think it was Jo pointed that out, that the medical profession find this very difficult. That really does need to be addressed, because of advanced care plans are next to impossible to put into place if they're not open to having clinical pathways towards death, which can facilitate a good death. There are a lot of illnesses, like late stage dementia, for example, where there isn't a clear route kind of out of that, where the person can end up going on for quite a long time if they don't have an advocate. That really needs to be looked at, and shouldn't be left at the discretion of whether a medic is able emotionally to have that conversation or not. Also, the quality of end-of-life care in hospitals is something that I really wanted to speak about. 60% of people will die in hospital. That's often because there aren't any carers at home and because symptoms can't be managed at home, and that's a fact. Trying to work at home with as a single person, as a carer of a person. How alone would you cope with the laundry? It's on a practical matter if a person has severe incontinence issues, and it's that kind of thing that really pulls the rug out of home deaths. So if we accept that people are going to be dying in hospital, then you need to look at the conditions that nurses are working in, because it's pretty dire, with chronic understaffing, institutionalised bullying, 12-hour shifts. This is stuff that isn't being aired. And a lot of complaints come towards the NHS about end-of-life care. But, if the nurses aren't treated with dignity and respect, and they're not, with the working conditions being as they are, then it's understandable that they just become numb and lose their sensitivity to people, because if you don't, then you'll burn out. That's where the majority of the work's going on in end-of-life care. In the last days and hours of life, for 60% of the population is in general hospitals, and I really feel that the working conditions of nurses needs to be addressed. It's not good, and it's not being looked at.
Thank you, Rebecca. I've got to have a final word from Rosie.
I told you it was a big subject. It's huge, and there are so many facets once you go off and discuss it. It's not only medics and the medical profession who are ill-informed and have lack of support. We call them the gatekeepers. Everybody from registrars, social workers, the police, coroners. Loads of people have got completely the wrong ideas about what are the people's options, what the laws are surrounding death and dying. We've got a lot of work to do.
On Skype, we're joined by Rebecca Green, who's a death doula. And also on the panel is Rosie Inman-Cook from the Natural Death Centre and the Association of Natural Burial Grounds. I think I'd like to start by introducing you to the audience by telling us a little bit about yourselves. Rebecca Green, you're a death doula. That's not something people hear of every day. Could you tell us what you do?
It kind of evolved naturally out of my job as a nurse. I'm still a practicing nurse as well. That's where I kind of learnt the job. It's really just being a companion to people that are dying, and I've also got a skill set, having worked as a nurse for 18 years in a variety of clinical settings, where I'm able to anticipate some of the journeys that they might go on throughout the healthcare system, and to be able to offer them some clarity in that, because it is quite a juggernaut, the NHS. It's oversubscribed and underfunded, and it causes a lot of problems for people. I think they lose their sense of it's difficult to have some personalness with it, so that's why I kind of.
You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. Discussing dying and making end-of-life plans remain taboo for many people in the UK. A survey by charity Dying Matters reveals that more than 70% of people in Britain are uncomfortable talking about death. A poll of 2,000 adults for the Charities Coalition of Care Organisations indicates that only 21% of people have discussed their end-of-life wishes. Only a third said they had written a will, and just 29% had let loved ones know of their funeral wishes. Around 500,000 people die in England each year. Half of all those people die in hospital, yet 2/3 of us would prefer to die at home. And only a quarter of men and just over 1 in 3 women across England have told anyone about the funeral arrangements they would like to have after they die. So why do people in Britain shy away from discussing this important subject? Is it a case of being a bit stiff upper lip about it? And what does death mean in our society? And is our attitude towards death changing? I'm joined by Jo Levinson, Director of Communications at Dying Matters Coalition and the National Council for Palliative Care.
Can be like the least influential factor in how they die, even though there is a lot of focus at the moment on end-of-life planning. But it's really how you've lived that will influence how you die more than anything. And I would say that there isn't really any such group as the dying, because we're all dying. You know, each person is completely, they're going to face this completely as they will every other day that they've lived. And no one really addresses that. So that's one of the major reasons that I do this. And that obviously has nothing whatsoever to do with medical care or the illness itself. It's the person's relationship with their life.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think I'll turn to Jo Levinson, who's on our panel from Dying Matters Coalition. You were both nodding there to what Rebecca had to say about at the end there about it not being discussed. Tell us what you do. What is Dying Matters?
The Dying Matters Coalition is a UK-based, very broad coalition. It includes hospices, doctors, nurses, funeral directors, lawyers, lots of charities, all of whom share the belief that actually we benefit by talking more openly about dying, death and...
Went ahead and did this. The biggest difference, I think, between a nurse and a death doula or end-of-life companion is I'm not allied to medicine, as nurses are. This is an independent role. Also, I'm not an organisation. I'm a person. I'm not a charity or a business. And I need to have that level of freedom to be effective and also to sort of operate outside of the economy as much as I can. Or I can't be as responsive as I need to be. What I actually do really varies from person to person. It could be just a couple of meetings. It could be, in one case, I moved in and lived with a person for a week until they died at home. Could be some help with end-of-life planning, giving them some opportunity just to sort of vent and get to know themselves a bit better and where they stand with this event that they're going to be meeting. I don't do it very often. I can go for years sometimes without working with a person. It's just only at any given person's request, if they know about me, if they know that I exist and that I do this. I think the circumstances of a person's death...
Bereavement. If we lose that, if you like, stiff upper lip or that reluctance to face up to our own mortality, we're more likely to get our wishes met. We're more likely to be able to be support for people we know, family, friends who are terminally ill, and more likely to be able to be supportive to people who've been bereaved. And certainly at the Dying Matters Coalition, our evidence has shown that in Britain, people on the whole aren't comfortable talking about dying. They're not comfortable facing up to their own mortality. They're not making their wishes known. And actually none of us benefit from that, even though we recognise talking about dying is rarely an easy conversation to have.
Rosie Inman-Cook, again agreeing with Jo there that we don't talk about it enough. You talk about it a lot. Can you tell us what you do?
We run a helpline, amongst other things. the Natural Death Centre charity, we've been going for 24 years now, and we get thousands of families contacting us with all sorts of different queries with all death and dying and funeral related issues. The one thing about communication I'd like to say is obviously it's crucial, and it makes it so much easier for those left behind to know where to start and what to organise. But